Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this 9th GARS seminar online panel discussion. Today, we're talking on regional airports and the challenges facing regional airports. At the risk of overstating it or at the risk of misstating it, I suspect that regional airports are a topic that are frequently overlooked. Perhaps that even indeed is part of the nature of being a regional airport. By definition, it's regional and usually it's quite small. But today we're going to talk about what might happen and what the challenges are for regional airports as they come out of the Covid-19 challenge or the Covid-19 pandemic and crisis. We have a really interesting panel that cuts across, I think, a lot of the sorts of ways you can look at this stuff. I'm delighted to say that we have Professor Peter Forsyth from Monash University in Melbourne, Noel Hiney from the Dublin City University, funnily enough in Dublin, Marek Bekier from ACR Aviation Capacity Resources, a Swedish company that looks at trying to provide outsourced services to airports and often remote services and so forth. David Starkie, from a consultant from Case Associates in London, and Tolga Ülkü, and I know I've mispronounced that, but you put two umlauts in the same name, Tolga, and you get what you deserve, who is also an academic from the International University of Applied Sciences. My name's Andrew Charlton, and I'm here to try to keep peace between the parties, not that I think there's a lot of argument to be had. If I can ask those of you not actually speaking to turn your cameras off and to mute yourself. Looking at you, Marina, thank you, Frederick, Sean and Antonio, I'd be very grateful, just because otherwise it's somewhat confusing. And thanks very much. So I might start, if I may, by asking you, Peter, what your views on remote airports and remote challenges are, partially because coming out of Australia, I think there's a really interesting tension. Coming out of Australia, remote airports are almost by definition remote, and there's not sorry, I'll try to say this again, I'm saying very poorly. In Europe, there are a lot of airports that would define themselves as remote, which in Australia would consider themselves almost beside another airport. Whereas in Australia, genuinely, some of those cities, some of those towns are remote. So what's your vision on how we go forward as for remote airports? Do you see a future for them that isn't simply slathered in government money?
Right, thanks, Andrew. Certainly you're right about that. So what I'd like to do is I'll say a little bit about the overall scene in Australia, regional-wise, and then talk about the responses to the COVID crisis. So first of all, looking at the market, Australia, not surprisingly, has a significant regional sector. And there are really two sorts of routes and markets and airports that we get. First of all, there are the market towns in the inland that would tend to be, let's say, at least 100 kilometres and probably more away from each other. So there's a limited amount of scope for competition. And then there are tourism destinations, mainly on the coast. And so you have lots of flights which connect between the towns and the main hubs like Sydney, Brisbane, etc. And most of the regional services in Australia are intrastate, and that's quite important. So you have various airlines, big airlines like Qantas and Virgin that are serving the markets, but in particular we also have a regional airline called Regional Express, or REX. And so that's the situation. Now, I think you might be aware that Australia has not had much of a pandemic in terms of overall cases and so on. However, it has also had very sharp lockdowns and over the last 6 months or even more, very substantial border limitations, so that you couldn't fly between Sydney and Melbourne for a lot of the time. Now as it opened up, but even now, you need to have a permit to go from Sydney to Melbourne.
I think that's only fair, Peter, if I may say. I don't think Melbourne should let anyone from Sydney in. That's a personal view.
Yes. Anyway, so that's the sort of situation there. Now, I think there are two major reasons why the situation with regional airports hasn't been too bad relative to what happened in the major airlines and indeed international and so on with Australia. So firstly, the airports tend to be owned by local governments. Now, they do have the ability to bear losses, especially for a reasonable time. And basically, the situation is improving quite a lot already. And so there's been a problem, sure, but it hasn't been too bad. No major financial problems. There may be one or two airports here and there that have had real problems for particular reasons, but I'm not aware of any major effect. So that's one thing. Second thing is...
sorry, just before you go on there, Peter, are there privately owned regional airports in Australia?
A few, but not very many. They're here and there, but not very many. And I'm not quite sure the exact situation of some of those airports. You know, somewhere in Queensland there was one, and so on.
You're discounting, though, I assume, private airports in the sense of owned and operated entirely by a mining company or by a grazing interest or something like that.
Yeah. I'm not. Yeah,
so publicly accessible. Yeah.
And also there are some airports that you might say are regional, but they're not that. You know, they're operating 737 services to a major city and so on. So some of the major Queensland cities, which are almost a quarter of a million people, that sort of thing. So they're not tiny regional operations there. So there are one or two airports like that that are owned by various private groups.
Sorry, Andrew.
Okay, so that's one thing that helped, namely local government ownership. The other thing that was quite important in Australia, not surprisingly, was that the federal government has given quite substantial support to the airlines, the regional airlines, and also a limited amount of support to the airports, mainly in the form of various infrastructure grants and so on, which is sort of all a bit indirect. But what is important is that the government decided, well, we need to have connectivity and we want to keep basic services going across the country. And so basically the government gave the regional airlines substantial amounts of funding to make sure that there is at least a sort of a basic service, not as much. Now, of course, there was still a really substantial reduction, but planes were still flying, at least to the sort of major, the various centres. And indeed, the regional airline, Rex, actually decided to start selling, started a service between Melbourne and Sydney. So, it's expanding. So it doesn't look as if it's in too much of a problem.
But again, so that growth of Rex as an airline, you see is funded based on its success in operating not Sydney, Melbourne, which is the busiest single two airport sector in the world, but actually, and by no definition, two regional airports. You think the success of Rex as an airline is based on its business success in operating around regional Australia?
Oh, well, what I'm saying is that it hasn't been too badly affected because it's been helped, and it's decided that it, you know, in this situation, it's able to start putting in new routes, which are not perhaps ones that it is particularly suited for at the moment. Maybe he'll make a go of it or not. We don't know.
But you've raised, I think, Peter, three really important issues, haven't you? First of all, the role of the airlines in a regional airport, and the role the regional airport plays in generating an airline, which in turn that perhaps bounces back into the airport itself. The second issue that you've raised, I think that's very important, is state money, government money, and the role that government money has to play or doesn't have to play or can or not can play or cannot play. And I think the third thing is, and I've sort of skirted around it, and the panellists will know we've had a quite heated discussion internally on the question of the definition of what is regional, because I think regional in Australia takes on a slightly different definition to regional in Europe, for example. But I'm really fascinated that what seems to have happened, whilst there's been state ownership of the airports, the success for the airports has been in giving state ownership to the airlines. Sorry, state assistance, not state ownership, state assistance to the airlines. Am I missing the point there, Peanut? Oh,
well, I mean, both are helped. And so that the federal government's airline subsidies mean that the airline is able to operate various flights, and that means that the various services are being operated, and the airports have something to do and can get some revenue. And so what you get, it varies from place to place, and I'm not really, I haven't seen a sort of a careful research study of this, but this is sort of picking up from the newspapers and so on. But you find that the airports that are supplying the market towns in the inland have been doing relatively well. That they went down to about 25% of their normal business. Now that's certainly not terrific, but when compared to what was going on in Sydney and Melbourne and so on, that was 5%. Yeah, right. On the other hand, the airports that are serving the tourism destinations, they seem to have really had a tough time, going down to about 5%. So that's the sort of...
And I should say for non-Australians or those not in Australia listening, recently the Australian government has in fact yet again subsidised tickets on airlines by giving half-price tickets to a selection of various, mainly tourism destinations. Again, I guess in the hope of rebolstering the business, which is obviously good news for Qantas and Virgin and Rex, but also perhaps for some of those tourism airport destinations. Rather than make this a conversation about Australia, which obviously I'd be more than happy to do, perhaps I'll turn to you, Olga, and ask you, given that in Australia, what's the situation in Europe? To what extent is it the same? To what extent is it different?
Well,
Tolga, you're on mute.
I don't need...
Thank you, Andrew. Well, if we switch now to Europe regarding the question of regional airports, I think one of the open questions which is a bit challenging to answer is whether we observe regional airports as on the black side, so to say, as a public good, kind of a public good, or just like a profit-oriented business. And I think we are somewhere in the gray area because each airport has a different task in this respect. So it requires a big differentiation in my point of view. But then, according to how we observe the airports, there are different challenges that they have been facing even before the COVID crisis started. So, for example, when we regard the airport as units which create economic activity, then the challenges are to decide how many of these business units do we need, or airports do we need, and where exactly? And I think in order to be able to answer such questions, we need systematic scientific methods to answer, such as cost-benefit analysis. On the other hand,
so you're heavily into state planning for a regional airport.
as I said, not for all of them, but if we are to observe these airports as necessity for economic activity, or the next point, necessity for mobility, for example, then
well, indeed, and sorry, just to interrupt you again there, I did mean to say the other point Peter raised that I think was interesting, and then you're just about to get onto, is connectivity. So you're saying connectivity is an important function that these airports play.
Definitely.
Right.
Definitely.
So does that give them a requirement for state money to preserve the connectivity? What about trains?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Well, actually, the bottom line of my talk, which I was going to say at the end, I could bring it now because you directly asked.
I'm sorry, I could stop interrupting you.
No problems, no problems. It's also good to start from the end and come back to the details. Well, the thing is, yes, these airports have difficulties in becoming profitable to recover their costs because of the reasons that we know, with all these fixed costs, etc. However, even before the pandemic and after the pandemic, there are new challenges coming. Subsidy is definitely not a solution, right? People living around these regional airports should have to know that an airport is not a free gift. So there are a lot of efficiency issues here, and I think a combination of managerial, economic, and technical solutions could be the answer to this problem, right? I mean, we are not expecting that these airports are going to be profitable, all of them, but still being efficient is very important, which is going to decrease the burden of either to the taxpayers or whoever is covering these losses.
Okay, well, I'm really interested that you're taking this role. There's the value of connectivity. There's many airports. How do I say this politely? I think you just said, Tolga, that some of them seem to be very poorly managed. Or let me rephrase that. That's me being rude. Let me rephrase that. Some of these airports could be better managed. Definitely. More efficiently managed. I know David's got views on this. I know Marek's got some slides on this as well. So we'll talk about costs, and partially that's an issue of costs. But just for a minute, before we get on to the costs issue, as important as that is, I still want to sort of probe the connectivity point. Clearly in Australia, if you live somewhere like Deniliquin or, Gunnedah or places like that, the aeroplane is probably the only viable alternative, or a 10-hour drive. That's less the case in Europe, but there are still places in Europe for whom the connectivity matters, aren't there? And to what extent do you think that local residents should understand that their connectivity is being subsidised? To what extent should it be subsidised, and to what extent should they pay for it themselves?
Well, I think it is not a very easy question to answer. I don't think there is a direct answer to this question. I wish there was.
Don't tell me, let me guess, you're an academic, is that right?
Right.
Yeah, right. How'd I guess that?
Well, what I can say about this is basically it is probably about how you organize such airports in your country. I mean, in Europe, we see different type of governance structures and organizations. For example, some airports are being organized as a group, and some airports are by themselves, which of course both bring some advantages and disadvantages. So obviously, if you organize all the airports in a country, or a part of airports in a country, that gives you the possibility to cross-subsidize by using the profits from the big profitable airports with a lot of passengers, like in Spain, we have INR in Norway, for example. So the system itself is a self-sustaining system. But
so sorry, just to make sure we're all clear, what that system would be one where you've got, I'm struggling with the word private here, private airports, but the price of owning the profitable airport, Oslo or Madrid or whatever, to use your two examples, is that you must also subsidise, cross-subsidise the smaller airports around the rest of that particular country.
Right.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
I mean, it is not about the ownership, whether private or or public, right? I mean, we have read the news, for example, it was yesterday that Vinci got the concession of 6 airports in Brazil. And I think one of these airports is rather a larger airport, still regional, but relatively larger, and the other 5 are relatively small airports. So as far as I understand it, the owner gives it like a package to the private firm. If you want to have the big airport, you also have to get the responsibility of the small ones. We also have these examples in Greece, where Fraport is now managing 14 airports, as far as I remember. Some of them are relatively big, and most of them are very, very small. Or in Portugal, for example, the whole system of airports with ANA has been also given to Vinci, and because it is not possible that you can capture private interest to very small airports if you want to just give it to the private hands, unless you are using a concession system where, again, the government somehow subsidizes this private firm to manage. And I don't know if we can call it still a privatization, or is it just a
corporatization
management contract, right?
Yeah. So what about then more freestanding, smaller and regional airports? Are there examples of those?
Could you please repeat?
So I'm thinking of smaller airports, regional, perhaps. I've got one in particular in mind just because I know it. Pula in Croatia, regional, never gets up to 1 million passengers. It's owned by the local councils, the 3 local councils surrounding it. Is that model common?
That is definitely common, where the local authorities, communities, so to say, have the ownership of the airport. I mean, we can observe that around Europe. And here, I think the solution to run a successful business there is to capture all the stakeholders in the region. So it really requires a complete strategy to be successful. For your example, Pula Airport lives from tourism, right? So I think this airport cannot, I'm not going to say survive, but cannot be successful if they are not working together with the airlines, having a good route development, if they do not work with the local trade association, tourism offices, and local authorities, and of course also with the local people in the region.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, the issue you run there, of course, is you get sailed very close to the wind in European state aid law. Well, you used to before we threw away the state aid rules at the start of the pandemic, but you're always close to the line there, because the test is, would a commercial airport do this? I'm now on a soapbox, I apologise to everyone. Whereas actually I think the test is, would a commercial tourism association do this? Would they discount their fees sufficient to bring tourists in? But anyway, that's as it is. So with varying models, Noel, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on all of this. How important do you think airports are to connectivity and so forth?
Thanks very much, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, I certainly believe that if you look at how important regional airports are, one way to define it is that they connect people and markets in smaller and peripheral parts of not just Europe but the world with more substantial population centres. Now that model, even before COVID, has been very challenged, as we know, in terms of, you know, the challenges for achieving profitability. And in European terms, some suggestions that a lot of the smaller airports without state aid would be totally unprofitable. So I think against the background of that very high level of connectivity and how important it is, if I can just focus on Europe for a minute, Airports Council International has estimated that about 6,000 routes that were stopped in April haven't yet been reinstated. And the importance of state aid in helping regional airports that aren't really operating to anything like the same level, or sometimes not at all, is worth just, I think, spending a little bit of time on, because there, you know, in the past, state aid was quite industry specific. At the moment, though, if you take a lot of European countries, you have two types of state aid. You have horizontal state aid, which is the state aid that all organizations in the state are being given as a result of COVID. So this state aid, for example, will be a payment per employee to keep them in employment. It can also be a payment to an organization whose income has dropped by 80% because of COVID. It can also be a commercial rates waiver if it's, you know, in terms of public companies. And sometimes, sometimes in those situations, that aid is keeping airports going. And governments can provide an awful lot of that aid at the moment because the cost of money is very cheap. There's very, very little, like if you take the cost of money on the interbank markets, the amount of debt that Ireland, for example, is taken on because of COVID payments is phenomenal. Now that's for everybody. But then when you look at airports, there are some specific regional airport support schemes. And in Ireland, the smaller airports can get aid for station security, safety and security, refurbishments like baggage screening upgrades, security upgrades and things like that. And also, it's interesting that some of that state aid at the moment has sustainability measures attached to it. So we know about Air France's rescue package having a diminished kind of impact on its domestic network versus what was originally intended. But in Ireland, the airport-specific state aid has a sustainability element to it as well, in terms of, you know, airport buildings, tugs, runway lighting, etc., being as energy efficient as possible. Now, I think, Andrew, the problem is that as we emerge from COVID, you know, as the tide goes out, there will be persistent structural issues that affect regional airports that are going to come to the fore. And unlike in the past, governments may not have the financial strength to support specific sectors because all sectors have been so badly affected by COVID. So I think I worked in financial services before, and in Ireland, the long term, you hear of long COVID, but the long term effect of the financial crisis is still being felt here, with two big Irish banking groups pulling out of the country nearly 15 years after the crisis started. I think some of the challenges that regional airports are facing are probably going to be more pronounced once things get back to normal, because we all know the recovery is going to be slower than expected. Yeah. Hub Airport might come back more quickly as well.
Is the recovery now going to be slower than expected or slower than hoped?
Probably slower than hoped, I would say.
Mm. I don't think the real epidemiologists, as opposed to the rest of us, amateur epidemiologists, I don't think that they think it's going to be quick.
Yeah.
You've raised though. Sorry, Noel, Karen.
No, I was going to say I have done a set of interviews, 65 interviews with airport and airline stakeholders in the last couple of months, and I have a couple of slides that I'm happy to share at some stage if you want me to do that as
sure.
well.
Sure. Well, I'm more than happy.
Keep that in your back pocket, yeah.
Thanks very much. But before you do that, I'd like to, you've raised I think the most important point, and this seems to be what's rolling through in the chat at the moment. In academic terms, I don't understand, academic and economists. My first question to everybody is, what application for state aid could you write in Europe that currently would get rejected? I defy anyone to write a state aid application that gets knocked back. I would love to know what you've got to put in it to get your state aid application rejected. That's my first point. But my second point is more important than that, although I think the first one is not unimportant. And that is the point you made, Noel, that when the tide goes back out again, we'll see who's swimming naked. And when all of the state aid money is taken away, is used or whatever, the question then, I think you made exactly the right point, which is that there are some massive underlying structural issues for small and regional airports. And as Akam, I think it's Akam says, you know, it's even very difficult to define what a regional or a small airport is. Are we talking passenger numbers? Are we talking profitability? Are we talking distance from a major population hub? No one seems to have a definition, but it's also true, I think, that leave the state aid out for a moment, and even if you come back to the point Tolga made, which is that there are subsidies for connectivity that are paid for by some airports, in effect, how do you make a regional, what are the issues facing regional airports? You wash away the state aid, if you like. Have you had any thoughts in all your interviews? I mean, is now the moment to drop those slides in?
I can drop those slides in. The one thing I would say, Andrew, is that one set of steps that a lot of airports across Europe, and I'm sure more globally, has taken is, despite the fact that they have been given incentives to keep employment, a lot of airports have reduced employment significantly.
Right.
And obviously, the drive for efficiency is very important. So in some airport groups, core employment has reduced by about 30%. So
Right.
that certainly gives an airport like that a better prospect of survival. So notwithstanding the support that they've been getting, some airports have taken tough decisions about what needs to happen. I'm going to, if I
just before you do that, actually, sorry, Noel, I said drop your slides in, but before you do that, perhaps now that I think about it, I know that both Marek and David have got views on the successful operation of airports. So David, maybe I could turn to you. I should say, ladies and gentlemen, that in the preparation for this, I took a view that the sort of standard view that if you're an airport of less than 1 million passengers, you will never be profitable, to which David took extreme outrage. Quite rightly. So, David, you're on mute, incidentally, but what's your view on the point Noel made that it's all about, take the state aid out, it's all about management?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, okay. It's not just about management; it's about culture. Here in the UK, we have a very commercial airport industry. And in terms of the COVID situation, we've got what Noel referred to as horizontal subsidy. There've been furlough schemes. There's been business rate relief, that's local tax relief. Although I have a question, I'm trying puzzling in my mind there as to whether that actually airports qualified for that, but parking that for the moment. The only specific airport-related subsidies that the government, central government, has offered up to, and I stress that, up to £8 million that airports can apply for. Now, £8 million in terms of Air France and Lufthansa, you've been talking about billions and billions. I mean, £8 million, 10 million euros is trivial. And that's
a very good lunch for Air France executives.
And that's all that's been on offer. And it is a very commercial airport industry over here. Can I go into what I was going to say?
Yeah, sure, please, because I know you're
okay.
keen to talk about management.
Sure. And that's where I'm coming from, this culture of commercialism, which is now embedded in the UK airport sector. It's not exclusively private by any means, but it has this commercial outlook. I think the problem when we address regional airports and taking Andrew's criterion of less than 1 million passengers, the problem is that we consume airport services as individuals, as passengers. We're using airports because we're going to catch a flight, or we're meeting somebody that's come off a flight, or we're delivering to the airport somebody that's catching. We have this firm concept that what airports are about is passengers, but it's far more than that. Airports, and particularly regional airports, small airports, are business platforms, and they're multi-product industries. And as such, they're fascinating, which, give a plug, is the subject of a book I'm writing at the moment, The Airport Enterprise. So most airports are actually very complex businesses. And I think really we should look at them ideally in terms of their turnover, not passengers, which we tend to focus on. Of course, it's very hard to get data on turnover. So hence the fact we focus on other things. I think there are two types of regional airports. One of the community service airports that Tolga mentioned earlier, and Noel did as well, that are particularly prevalent in Norway, the Highlands of Scotland, in Western Ireland, and so on. And there are the commercial airports that I'm speaking about in the UK, or most of the UK. And they're very diversified, the small ones, in terms of what services they provide. You've got pilot training, you've got aircraft maintenance, you've got corporate jet activities with fixed base operators, which are like mini terminals for corporate business jets, cargo and postal freight, general aviation, including air taxi services, flying clubs, a big business at many of the small regional airports, private flying clubs, government-related flights, that's air ambulance, search and rescue, and military movements. Military movements can be important at some. And also a non-aviation related activity acting as a landlord for businesses that are on the airfield estate, because there are often redundant and old buildings that are passed on for other business use, but the airport still acts as a landlord and gets a lot of rent from those businesses. I can't cover obviously all those aspects in detail, but I'll just take one of them: freight and air postal freight, air cargo. In cargo shipped in all freighter aircraft has actually had a relatively good COVID, relatively good. Or actually in absolute terms, it's had a good COVID, partly because belly hold freight has slumped, because the hubs have closed down pretty well. And e-commerce, on the other hand, has grown. And this has been fortunate for airports like Liège in Belgium, which has around 1/3 passengers a year, but has seen its freight grow by 24% in 2020 and has well over 1 million tonnes of freight coming through it. Zaragoza in northwest Spain is another example. Before COVID, Zaragoza was the fastest growing freight airport in Europe, but has in normal times under 500,000 passengers a year.
But Zaragoza almost qualifies as what Peter and I were talking about before, doesn't it? I mean, that's, as indeed does Liège. I mean, they are basically corporate airports used by one company. In Liège, it's DHL, and I think it's DHL, maybe it's FedEx. In Zaragoza, it's that clothing company, the Rapid Turnover Clothing Company, the name of which has suddenly escaped me, my daughter will be across with me for years now over this, but it's the centre from which all the clothes that go out to that Rapid Turnover Clothing Company, the name of which I've forgotten, comes from. So, I mean, at one level, they're almost, I take your point that these are not passenger airports, these are cargo airports. I think I mean, I think a passenger flying into Zaragoza must be lost.
Yeah. Leipzig is a little bit in between. It's got roughly 2.5 million passengers.
But it's actually half.
Still below our 3 million threshold. Agreed, the 1 million. But Leipzig is huge in air freight, of course. But there are a lot of others like Maastricht and Saarbrücken, Antwerp, Billund in Jutland are all important in air freight terms. And the point is that is bringing in revenue. If I can quickly turn to my second string of the bow, let me take regional airports in the UK. A number of the sub 1 million passenger airports have been busy serving North Sea oil and gas rigs and wind farms. Airports like probably people have never heard of, Blackpool and Norwich. And
I've heard of Blackpool.
You've heard of Blackpool, you've been up the tower probably.
Never been there.
They're been very busy during COVID serving the gas rigs offshore or serving the oil fields. Then you've got airports like Bournemouth, which has done well because it has a lot of maintenance facilities there, and it's had a lot of tests and test flights going on, which pay runway fees. And British Airways has laid up a lot of their fleet at Bournemouth. So Bournemouth are raking in money from BA for BA parking up their aircraft. Newquay, with less than 500,000 a year, has done very well actually recently with military flights and air taxis and test and training flights. In February, the third busiest airport in the UK was Steventon, otherwise known as Gloucestershire Airport. And whereas Heathrow in February had 8,000 air transport movements, Gloucestershire had half that number. It's the third busiest actually in the country, but a lot of that was test and training flights because of maintenance facilities there. The last one perhaps I'll mention is Shoram Airport. Shoram Airport again had a large number of test and training flights. Shoram recently renamed Brighton, which incidentally claims to be the world's oldest purpose-built airport. predates the First World War, apparently. Now, Shoram, like several others on the CAA's reporting register, had no terminal passengers at all in 2019. A lot of those small ones don't. No passengers. But fundamentally, the fundamental point, in normal times, these airports are profitable businesses, but they have no passengers. And yet we're obsessed by focusing on airports through the focus of passengers.
Well, I mean, I think we're obsessed on two things, aren't we? And you raise one, well, you raise them both. You're right. Most of the time we look at airports in terms of passenger numbers, and you're absolutely right. And your point is completely correct that we should be looking at successfully managed. I'm trying desperately not to use the word profitability, although I think ultimately you can't not use the word profitability, which then comes back to things like cost savings and so forth. And Marek, you've been incredibly patient, and I'll come to you in just a moment. But the other thing, of course, is that perhaps you can measure success in terms of connectivity, which clearly cargo airports are an important part of. So, you know, the question then sort of falls to, is it a state responsibility to provide connectivity? And if it is it a state responsibility to provide connectivity through an airport, or is it through roads or rail or better internet? I mean, there's all sorts of ways you can do that. But Marek, can I turn to you at long last? And I do thank you for your patience. And Peter, I'm coming back to you, don't worry. And I know that from your perspective, you think that there's a lot of things that airports can do to improve their position. So perhaps I could ask you to fill me in on your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I was wondering, I have prepared just a few slides. Not even gonna take 5 minutes.
You go, and then Noel, then to you, Noel. So thank you.
Sure. Let me see here. I can do this.
And just while you're getting them out, can I just say to my point on the comments side there, nobody can use, gosh, you have a few slides. Nobody can talk to me about the United Soviet States of America being an example of anything to do with anything other than abject socialism, but carry on, Marek.
No, look, thanks. When I saw the theme of this panel about how has COVID-19 changed the perspective of the regional airports, you know, we are a terminal ANS provider. We're currently operating 17 airports here in Scandinavia. So I can just share a bit our experience throughout COVID. And I know this is you know, compared to David, this is a much more broader approach, but it is a fact. 67% of all airports were loss-making in 2018, and 97% of all airports below 1 million pax are loss-making. There are niches, there are airports that are doing well, that's fantastic. But the big picture is there is a correlation between the passenger volumes and the ability to operate profitably. I'm not saying it's impossible to do it otherwise, because you see there are airports here, even in that segment, up to 50,000 passengers that can make money. But as a rule of thumb, you would say it is very difficult, the smaller the passenger number.
That's your Zaragoza and your Liège and so forth, I guess.
Yes. It's an asset-intense business, and you know, you need passengers to actually generate the revenue. And this was before COVID. You know, this was a grim situation before COVID for the regional airports, and then COVID hit. And we have all seen the numbers, what happened to the big airports, to the airlines and the state aids and all this. So everything went south. So, but how did it look for our airports? And just here, we compared the numbers of these airports, and we saw that we had actually, throughout 2020, a decline of 10%, but this is movements. So be careful, because this is movements and not passenger numbers. If you look at the passenger number decline, it would be significantly higher, because the lower cost carriers have withdrawn, charter flights are gone, domestic traffic is more or less gone. It's coming back now slowly, but it's been replaced with business flights, cargo flights, ambulance flights, postal flights. And this brings an interesting point, and that many of you have touched before. In a crisis situation, as we've seen in the pandemic, the regional airports, regardless who owns them, they have an important, a key function as a part of the national readiness, emergency infrastructure, if you want. And if you look at it from that perspective, you can actually ask yourself, oof, if they are of national interest in an emergency situation, are they eligible for national subsidies, even if they're private owned? Now, if you look at the cost side, 2/3 of the costs are operation costs on airports. And again, this is overall, it includes all airport sizes. I'm sure there's variations between countries and airport sizes in particular, but just to give a bird's view here, 2/3 of all the costs are operation costs, and 1/3 is costs, capital costs, if you want, or fixed costs. And I'm not looking at those because they're fixed. So it's difficult to change them. And if you look at the operation expenses, you see that staff costs are 1/3, and then here contracted services is 25% on average. We have made the experience in our airports that contracted services includes ANS, and ANS is air traffic control, met services, and so on. And that can be, depending on the airport, up to 50% of the operation costs. And again, there is a correlation between the size of the airport and the relative cost of ANS. So we have a small AFIS airport, and where the cost was 50%. And that's very difficult to make money if the cost is so high. When this is said, exactly for this kind of segment, to bring the costs down is crucial. And if you look at the distribution of the costs, you would say, yeah, you have to do it either with staff or with contracted services. And that's my last slide, Andrew. So just to sum it all up, profitable operation was even before COVID. Very, very challenging for most of the regional airports. PAX numbers, passenger numbers is important if you want to see if an airport can be operated profitably. In our view, COVID has not changed the perspective of the airports, but it has amplified the underlying structural problem. And COVID has as well highlighted the need for bringing down the cost base of the airports. And we all know, or most of you know that slide here, and this is what you've seen for terminal ANS, changing the change of service provision or the change to a digital service provider. I'm talking about remote towers, whatever, this can yield significant cost savings for the airport. And that could be one element in the whole package to bring down costs for an airport. And I have noted as well, in addition, and I'm following up on Tolga here, I'm very agreeing with him, airports, regional airports have to be a bit more clever in defining and adjusting their business models. There is a UAS industry out there that needs certain services that a regional airport can very well do. I'm thinking about common procurement structures for services for airline groups, for airport groups, and yeah. So there are possibilities. I think they have to be a bit more innovative, and but it is a difficult situation with these low passengers numbers. And that was it.
Wow, thank you. Noel, I know I think this dovetails perfectly into the slide you were going to have. Is that right? Is now a good moment? You're on mute. Only the fourth time I've said it today.
Yeah. No, I'll mute. Yeah, I'll just share a couple of slides if that's okay, which I think.
Thank you. And just while you're getting them up, Marek, thank you for that. I'm really interested, and again in the chat box, we're having this conversation. You said there's an argument for a regional airport to be a infrastructure provider of national importance, if you like, national readiness, etc. Does that mean you think we should be subsidising them?
Somebody mentioned that is a grey area. I think there are situations and there are moments, particularly throughout the pandemic, when I think it's justifiable. I think the industry is normal growth, and these airports run profitably, they're private run or run by the community. I don't see why the federal government should step in principle. But if the federal government is using the regional airport as a part of its emergency or readiness infrastructure, then they should pay its share to the airports in such a situation.
Right. So actually the answer to the question is no. I mean, only if they're using it as a specific part of national infrastructure, as opposed to sustaining it for local connectivity and those sorts of issues. You know, local. Let's call connectivity what it is: local convenience. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Noel. I'm ready when you are.
That's great, Andrew. Thanks. I hope everybody can see the screen. Is that okay? And hear me as well. I'm just going to focus on the COVID nature of the interview. Now, I suppose just very quickly, these interviews were done in the context of broader research I'm undertaking in relation to a lot of what we've been talking about today, which is the relationship between regional airports and their economy and the local economy and the local environment, the local community. So in the context of COVID-19, these interviews took place between October 2020 and the end of February 2021. Obviously, they were all done remotely, mostly Zoom and Teams. And they were with entities serving Ireland. So a lot of international organizations, a lot of international aviation organizations that have activities in Ireland were interviews as well. So a lot of the comments are not just Irish specific, even though that was the focus of the research. So, so very quickly, I suppose, before going into COVID-19, using the stakeholder framework, airports and airlines are each other's key relationship. And I think we'll see that relationship has been amplified as a result of COVID. The nature of the relationship in terms of its intensity is more influenced by the size of the airport rather than whether it's a publicly owned or a privately owned airport. And in some cases, there's a triangular relationship. For example, we mentioned earlier on an airport, an airline, a cargo airline and a local authority, an airport, an airline and tourist authority, etc., etc. Larger organizations tend to have a very structured approach to stakeholder management. And there's a lot of network activities like route conferences and things like this. So if I can just, you know, the importance of personal relationships at the point of stakeholder contact was emphasized very quickly, as was the ability to escalate and resolve issues effectively. And these became important factors during the COVID-19 experience. So what all stakeholders would have observed during the initial shutdown period was a very high level of interactivity, very positive, you know, previously intractable issues were easier to address. For example, you know, getting passengers home, getting aircraft parked, getting aircraft temporarily parked. How many airports are now car parks, which has an impact on some airports because their pavement wasn't designed to park planes as much. And there's a very strong view that the crisis presents a key opportunity for new thinking in the future. But, you know, will that opportunity be taken by everybody? That's a question. Agility will need to be very important and collaboration will be very important, which we'll come back to in a minute, because the circumstances are changing. There's very, very little certainty, even a couple of months ahead, about what a route kind of map looks like for an airline and indeed for an airport. One very interesting, probably unsurprising finding was that all stakeholders focus on their own challenges. And the amount of times during the interviews I would have heard that cash is king and survival is key became very important. And, you know, once that initial engagement in terms of getting into shutdown phase started, the amount of stakeholder engagement stopped for a while organizations focused very much on their own internal challenges. One interesting point that came through was a lot of organizations, I mentioned earlier on about the loss of staff, a lot of organizations would be worried about the loss of organizational memory. I mentioned, you know, a lot of companies have had voluntary redundancy programs. Those tend to involve a certain amount of senior people who know the way around the airport a lot. And while regulators insist that airports and other aviation companies cover off the loss of such memory from an operational point of view, from a business point of view, and in terms of the softer stuff like the relationship between the airport and the airline and the local and the local regions, that can be an issue, that loss of key personnel where you might have been dealing with somebody. So that was just an interesting finding. In terms of emerging from COVID, it's interesting when the interview started, it was all about dancing with the virus and not knowing what way the virus was going to come. Later on, the vaccination kind of changed the argument a little bit. I think all stakeholders felt that persistent structural issues were now to the fore, and after what we've mentioned earlier on, after we emerge from COVID-19, these may need to be addressed. That's not just an issue for airports, it's an issue for, you know, for airlines, for ground operators, for all the kind of stakeholders we talked about. And that fed into very high levels of concern about the future, and an acknowledgement that difficult decisions affecting airports may need to be considered and taken. Because I think one of the things that a few of us have said is, what is the purpose of an airport? What is the purpose of the regional airport? The purpose of the regional airport is connecting the local economy with other markets and other parts of the country in Europe. But if governments are financially stretched in the way that they never were before because of COVID, support may need to be rationed in a way that it never was before. There's strong agreement from everybody that a shared and coordinated approach to recovery is successful. Finally, I think you know, most stakeholders talked about the need for coherent cross-border strategies, not at all evident to date, with different governing regulations, with countries even within the European Union interpreting some of the guidelines differently. And another interesting point was, now is the time for airports to explore what the post-COVID-19 environment looks like with stakeholders, whether that's more efficient terminals. I mean, a lot of time, even though sustainability challenges were highlighted more intermittently than in every interview, other things like digital, the contactless passenger journey, and digital means, which have been talked about before, are certainly much more to the fore. So when we get our head above water, how can we innovate as a result of what COVID-19 has forced us to do? Future engagement may be more remote. I mean, most of the engagement, other than the front line operational activity, has been remote, and a lot of parties see that continuing. They don't see the same need. So finally, subdued expectations, but the vaccine rollout and health passport developments give rise for great optimism. I asked everybody what they thought about the future, and most interviewees expected a modest recovery in 2021, with new normality timeframes not clear for a couple of years yet. That's not to say when the new normality will return. It's a case of when we know it will return, and that refers to something that you said earlier on. The last point there is the importance of collaboration and coordination. And I think that's also reflected in Eurocontrol, because when the crisis started, it predicted that under a coordinated scenario, traffic decline could be confined to about 40% in total for the full year. The decline was actually 53%, or estimated to be 53% in September. And Eurocontrol would contend that you know, the uncoordinated nature of dealing with the challenges was one of the reasons why that performance was less than originally anticipated, which highlights how important coordination and collaboration is, feeding into the research area, which is stakeholder management. It's just a very high level set of observations, Andrew. I hope it's helpful in terms of the discussion we've been having.
It is. Is your report available, Noel, to us normal punters?
Not yet. It's still under. It will be, but it's under preparation at the moment.
Right. Fair enough. I'll look forward to reading that. Sounds very interesting. Peter, I want to come back to you, partially because now you've been the very patient one. I'm still fascinated by your observation that it was by subsidising the airlines that the regional airports in Australia survived much better. I also noted your comment in the chat that you don't think that small necessarily means unprofitable. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, I mean, I think that the size of the airport is not very closely related to its profitability or its ability to cover its costs. Basically, that you find that small airports are able to cover their costs by doing all sorts of things. Sometimes it's, well, in Australia and in some other cases, it's that small airports can also increase their prices or charges in order to cover their costs. That's one mechanism, if, of course, they don't have very much competition. But even apart from that, what you find is that the small airports go in for a lot of contracting out, and also there's a lot of multitasking. So that I used to be resident in a town which had a small airport, and you'd go to buy a ticket at the shop, and you'd speak to the guy there, and then when we got to the airport, you'd find that the person is doing the check-in is the same person, and then it's the you look at the who's taking the baggage out of the incoming plane. Oh, it's the same person, and so on. So pretty much in this small airport, this person was doing just about everything. So that I think that that's the way in which small airports are able to avoid the problems of low scale. And so if you look at the Australian regional airports, there's a slight correlation between size and profitability, but it's very rough indeed.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And but you've then raised, I think, another point, Peter, that was in the chat several hours ago before we got completely hijacked by theoretical economists, for which to everyone else I can only apologise. And that was the point that often, even at regional airports, we have this absolute Taj Mahal mentality going on, where people feel this overwhelming need to build amazingly bespoke devices and bespoke things. Whereas, you know, if you look at, you'd have thought there'd be an opening here for standardisation, right down, as you're saying, to standardisation of labour and no demarcation. Is there, and Marek, I think that also comes back to your point, doesn't it? I mean, isn't there scope for more, I'm trying to think what the right word is, I don't want to say aggressive, but certainly more focused management to try to hold costs down, to try to make the airport as functional as we can make it, rather than as egotistical as we can make it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the person or the group that is basically in the box seat are the owners. And in the case of the Australian airports, most of them are local governments. And that depends. So what the policies and objectives that those airports are looking towards are dependent upon what the local governments, their owners, want. And so some want to have value for money. They want to keep down charges and therefore not be a burden on their local taxpayers. On the other hand, there are some that have the view of build it and they will come. So it might be a place nobody's ever heard of. And they think, well, maybe if we have an extended runway to be able to get, let's say, 737s in, and an even bigger one perhaps to include 777s or something, because we'll get all these people from Europe and Asia coming into our little town because of tourism, which, you know, there are only about 5 tourists last year. And so that is a problem.
So you've been to Canamble then?
Sorry?
You've been to Canamble.
Well, could be, yes. So that is an issue, and it's basically the airlines that are pointing that out, as you might imagine, in some of the various reports that you can see. They're saying, well, we're quite happy with the airports that are trying to provide value for money, but we're worried about some which really are trying to do too much, trying to build tourism in a place that you're not likely to have too much tourism, and thinking spend money basically doing Taj Mahals and all the rest, and that happens, as we know, with big airports, but it also seems to be the case in some cases with small regional airports.
But yeah, but even when you're being realistic about your expectations and you're not assuming a cargo cult of build it and they will come, there seems to be an ability to be more assertive in your management, if you like. Because, and this is, I guess, at the end of the day, the challenge for all airports, large or small, is how do you balance the sort of societal good of connectivity versus operating something which requires massive subsidy, and at what point does the subsidy exceed the good of connectivity? At the moment, the answer seems to be that point. The subsidy will be too much when the subsidy is infinity. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's infinity minus one, but it's certainly not any sensible number, I don't think. So maybe, I mean, and I think, given that I only speak English, Japanese and French, I can't understand the rubbish, the really interesting stuff that's going on in the chat in theoretical economic terms. But I think that's what the theoretical economic stuff is saying. Where do we balance the cost of the connectivity versus the price of the connectivity, if you like, the value of the connectivity? Yep. Tolga, you've been very active on the chat, so the punishment you get for that is you're going to have to explain that to us normal people.
Okay, I will try my best. Basically, we are talking about the size of the cake in a given region. And the question here is whether we should focus on dividing the pie by allocating more to the consumers of air services or to the producers of the air services. All right. And in my point of view, the basic question is whether there is a trade-off or not. All right, especially in terms of small airports, which we regard as public services, right?
Why do we do that? Two things. First of all, when are we talking about the size of the pie or the slicing of the pie? One, and two, why do we regard small airports as public services? Why aren't they just public drains?
But it's what I'm saying. If we regard them as public services, as we had some examples, right, which create this mobility that we need, because obviously the rail services are not possible or very costly, right, for those areas, then basically the focus of the regulator or the owner, the governor here could be just to maximize the output of the services, right? So let's say,
which is passengers flying.
Exactly. In small airports, the authority can say, you know, here we want to have at least 4 flights a day, 2 inbound, 2 outbound. Yeah, or it can be 10 or it can be 20 according to the size of the airports, right? But we know there are also airports where there are really 4 flights a day. Okay? Or the question is, you know, we will just leave it to the market, and if the airport realizes that it doesn't have to be the passenger number. I guess that is one of the conclusions of this webinar. Maybe we should look at the number of air traffic movements, because it can be the private flights or even the ambulance flights or
UAM flights. Yeah.
Exactly, cargo. So we can take the so-called workload unit, which is a combination of cargo and passengers. If that is the focus, basically, then the airport should decide over the long run if they really want to stay in business or not.
Right. Okay.
And my point is that from an economic perspective plus a managerial perspective, it should be possible to reduce the inefficiencies in the production, in the system, right, in order to be able to increase the total.
I see the point you're making.
The size of the total cake. So the consumer will still benefit from that. Assume that at least they are going to stay at the same level, but on the other hand, via these increased efficiencies, the profits will be increased, so size will be higher. And this is the point, basically, where the focus should be on.
Right.
Of course, the answer is very challenging. I mean, I don't think that there is a clear-cut answer. Every regional airport should do that.
Man, I was hoping
in order
by,
to, yeah. But I think
I was
that we have
hoping by the end of
already.
the seminar we'd have the one answer.
Yeah, I'm sure that we already have a very, very good shopping list. As for
shopping or
I mean,
chopping,
Peter's
I'm not
examples, multitasking of the employees is one thing. Marek talked about the remote ATC units,
Provision.
which probably, exactly, assuming that 50% of the cost of an airport is coming from this side, probably it's a huge point. Noel talked about how to talk to the stakeholders. Maybe the role of ground handler is also huge at some airports. So obviously the manager of an airport should know by heart where the performance objective is, and then decide, this is the point where we should go. And of course, there's the overall economic term. I mean, like the bigger question, does it really make sense to run all the airports as a group? I mean, Swedish example is a good one. They also started with running, I think, I'm not sure, but all the airports together within the Swedavia group, and then they realized that they want to give back some of these small regional airports back to the communities, because I guess because they don't want to give the wrong incentives. You say you have the airport, and if you have losses, then they are being covered. So you have to decide by yourself, dear community, how to deal with this airport, right? Do you want to have an airport here, or do you want to have an additional school or university?
Yeah. So, Noel, in your conversations, which fascinating study, in your conversations, were these sorts of issues understood / addressed, do you think?
I think that one of the words that came up again and again was, I mean, first of all, even in the midst of the crisis, the importance of the regional airport to the hinterland that it serves was very, very strongly endorsed. That was a given. But I think that because of the crisis, the need for efficiency and the need to address efficiency issues that might have been put on the back burner in the past, not just with airports but with everybody, was actually identified very strongly and was being addressed. And that's, as I said, reflected. I mean, if you look at Marek's pie chart, a lot of the pie chart was in relation to personnel costs. So a serious reduction in the number of of people employed. I think the other point was the relationship between airports and their local community was another thing that came through very strongly, and especially with the smaller airports where this kind of concept when it comes to if a transport authority puts a new route on, a bus route even, there's a use it or lose it kind of approach to it. We'll operate this route for a while, but if it's not being used to a certain level, we'll have to withdraw it. And I think that the use of local airports by the community, the use of regional airports by the regional community, and the strength of that relationship was certainly something that came through again. But I think the other thing, to be fair, I think airlines, I think I mentioned about how important the airline-airport relationship is. I think that relationship has become even more important now because, it's the routes that drive the airport activity. And a lot of regional airports have been very dependent on a single airline. You know what I mean? So if that single airline moves its assets elsewhere, the airport can't do that. So that gets back to, I think the need for good engagement, but the need for the airport to be as efficient as possible as well. They're kind of some of the observations I would have picked up that I think are relevant.
Interesting. To what extent do you think, Noel, and then maybe David, you as well, to what extent does, and I mean, hear me out, to what extent does geography matter? In other words, what happens if there are two airports serving two communities which are frankly quite close, physically quite close together. I mean, what do we do in a situation like that? How do we make that social decision about which of the two we should support? Well, obviously, if you're in the airport industry, what you do is you propose building a third one halfway between the two of them, and then the local community won't let you shut either of the small ones either, but, you know, call me a cynic. To what extent does the geography matter, do you think, in terms of the community importance?
It probably matters more in some places than others, because if you take the peripheral areas of Europe, like Northern Scandinavia, the Greek islands, even some of the Western seaboards and smaller airports, there isn't a substitute option there. There isn't a rail line that could actually substitute in. And depending, you know, I think that's one factor that would need to be considered. I also think that there's a difference between public ownership and private ownership. So if an airport is owned by the state or by local government, as many of them are across Europe, probably not as many of those have closed in the past than private airports. So, for example, if you take Ireland, when a motorway network was built a few years ago, one privately owned airport closed altogether, and the other two have since closed passenger traffic. They were all private airports. I think the ownership of the airport, and I'm talking in the past, the ownership of the airport might have determined what actions might be taken. But again, when you look at state finances going forward, I think a big unknown is what's the long-term financial impact of COVID going to be on the ability of state to support not just the aviation sector, but other sectors as well in a COVID recovery phase, and what impact might that have on infrastructure, you know, somebody asked earlier on about train stations as well, you know, what impact, what's going to be the long-term impact of the financial hit everybody has had to take on COVID on infrastructure, I think is a broad general question.
I thought it was a really interesting point. I thought it was a really interesting point in the chat, you know, what is the community value, or what is the value of a train station if we're trying to measure that? And of course, the answer is exclusively connectivity and almost exclusively publicly funded. But every now and then we do have to make decisions, don't we, as countries, as train operators, to close particular stations. And when we do that, we have to, I presume, I say this, I've never been in the train industry, I presume we make that decision based on things like, are there substitutes or alternates, or could a bus go on the service just as cheaply? So David, in your model, in the culture of the UK in which you spoke about, how does a state get involved in making that decision, which of two physically close airports should be shut?
No, it doesn't. In fact, there's been competition cases over here. The Competition Commission has intervened when two neighbouring airports have sought to merge, and the Competition Commission has blocked that merger on competition grounds. We tend to take a very market-orientated view. If I could come back to the earlier point I made about culture, and the problem with subsidies is if subsidies are readily available, what does that do to the incentives of the management of an airport? Imagine, for example, if you, Andrew, your company was judged to be essential for your community. And
happy day.
And the state said, we'll subsidise you. We want you, Mr. Charlton, to try your best, you know, carry on as you do and get business in and so on. But at the end of the day, we're going to subsidise you. What would that do to your incentive system? And I think that's the problem. There was a lot of discussion earlier about the cost base of airports and whether you could get these regional airports to be more efficient. As soon as subsidies in there, you take away that incentive. And that's the cultural problem I was alluding to earlier on.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly take that point. I mean, just incidentally, I see the industry service I offer as being the industry's clown jester or court jester. So what would I do if further subsidised? I'd just be even ruder. So, you know, you can look forward or not to that depending on your point of view. Marek, I saw you nodding your head very ferociously there during David's comments. I presume you agree?
Yeah, 100%. I think this is something we have seen in many instances, that actually in many ways guaranteed subsidies are poisonous. They actually take away the last bit of entrepreneurial thinking from airport managers if they can rely on subsidies without, you know, having to work for it. And therefore, and this is what I said in the beginning, I don't support subsidies unless it's a very specific situation. In general, let the free market decide. You know, if you have two airports, and this was a question with two airports, and they're competing for an airline and for passengers, you know, if one airport can't make it, then probably it doesn't make sense that it exists. Then maybe it should scale down. And you know, I wonder why we don't let market forces more decide on what to do. And if a region says, okay, we cannot, you know, this airport is not operating profitably, and then it has the region or the community or the city council or whoever who wants this airport to run will have to subsidize it and to put money into it. And that's fair enough. But I think market forces are in the airline industry, they are in the supplying industry, they are in the, not in the ANS industry, but and we should...
a matter of time, Marek. I mean, that, and again, this was referred to in the chat about a month ago in the chat. A lot of the problem stems from the fact that the Chicago Convention was written in 1944 when our definition of the market was very different to our understanding of the market now, I think. And there was this, you know, peace, love, brown rice and kerosene sort of view that we'll all love each other forever sort of thing, you know, post-World War II. And airports were seen as part of the state government, or, you know, the national government and those sorts of things. In many countries, not in the United Soviet States of America, we've moved on from that. And in Europe, we certainly have. But we're really quickly running out of time now. But I still think one of the most interesting things that we've sort of skirted around a couple of times, despite my best efforts to bring it back, was the point Peter made that actually regional airports in Australia did much better. I'm not suggesting they were, you know, drinking champagne every morning, but did much better because the subsidy was to the airline, was to the producer of the passengers or the cargo, rather than to the producer of the runway. I think that's a really fascinating approach to take, and completely. Well, we've just poured bazillions of dollars, bazillions of euros into airlines in Europe, but the airports continue to struggle. So I think there's a really interesting problem there. So Peter, would you recommend that given that we've given 100 billion euros to European airlines and seemingly nothing to the airports, but still the airports are struggling, what should we be doing better?
Well, I think that the airports are, well, to the extent that the airlines are taking more passengers around, that helps the airports. And that was really the point that I was making in what I was saying, that in fact you find some airlines were doing reasonably well. I mean, in the sense of fairly low losses in the regional sphere. They did get subsidies. I'm not quite sure how well the subsidies were allocated. That's a real question as well. But I think also that you have to be aware that airports were also subsidized by their own owners, effectively. And so that's quite important as well. So that a state-owned or a local government-owned airport was allowed to operate at a loss. Indeed, maybe they had to keep going in this particular situation. But in the past, when things were better, there was quite a lot of divergence between the objectives of the different local government owners. Some wanted airports to become glitzy, etc. Others wanted value for money and good value for the ratepayers, etc. And so that was, I think that was very much an issue. And of course, that ties in with what Noel and Marek have been, and David have been saying about incentives. You know, what incentives are there facing the airport to be producing efficiently, whatever.
Yeah, so I mean, the interesting issue here is if we have to find a way to keep the industry running, and I think that of itself is a discussion we should be having, where is it best to spend our money in terms of subsidy that's not going to create the wrong incentives, not going to create the wrong outcomes, and not going to what's the word I want, perpetuate the problem. Maybe that's the issue. At that, we have actually reached our time. And I'd like to thank Peter, Tolga, Noel, Marek and David very much for their contributions. I have to say I really love the GARS platform because with 90 minutes you've really got time to start to get into a vast array of topics and to really roam around the horizon rather than just put a few things out there. So I'm really grateful to GARS for bringing such an incredible group together. And I'd like to remind you to save the date for the first of a series of 3 parts. This is part 1 of 3 parts for this year's European Aviation Conference. That parts 1 and 2 will be online. Part 3 we hope will be either in person or hybrid towards the end of the year. But it's all about climate change and aviation and what we do now rather than keep talking about it in the future. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and for your attention, for your really robust interventions on the chat. And again, thank Peter, Tolga, Noel, Marek and David for their contribution. And I wish you all a very good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.